Mr. President, I rise to discuss the PACT Act, for which we will be, on which we'll be voting for several amendments, and then we will have a final passage vote later this evening. This could have been resolved months ago, as I had suggested it would be, but finally we've gotten to the point where we can resolve this. And I have to say, we are witnessing a very old Washington trick playing out on what might be an unprecedented scale. And what is that trick? That trick is you take a very sympathetic group of Americans. It could be children with rare diseases. It could be victims of crime. It could be veterans who are suffering an illness after having been exposed to toxic chemicals while serving our country. You take this sympathetic group, craft legislation to address their problems, and then sneak in something that's completely unrelated, that could never pass on its own, and dare anyone to stand up and say a word about that, because we all know if you raise the concern about the unrelated provision, people in this chamber and outside will stand up and make up all kinds of fabrications and falsehoods. They will enlist some pseudo-celebrities. They will get their accomplices in the media to propagate the dishonest charge that, oh, those mean Republicans don't care about those sympathetic victims. That's what's been going on here for some time now. It's in the PACT Act. We have an exceptionally sympathetic, overwhelmingly popular group of Americans, and rightly so. They're veterans who put on the uniform, served overseas, took huge risks, and along the way were exposed to toxic chemicals that have resulted or could result in their illness. There's overwhelming consensus to provide the resources to at least cover their health care costs and provide them with disability benefits because of their service to our country. In fact, the cause is so popular that the $280 billion of new spending contemplated by this bill is completely unoffset. It's mandatory spending. It's like OCO. And there's nobody that I know of, certainly not myself, that's asking that it be offset. It's like, this is what we need to do. And people acknowledge this, and we agree on that. But that's not where the PACT Act ends. That's not all there is to the PACT Act. It also includes the old Washington trick. And the form the trick takes in this bill is a complicated change to budget rules that allows current spending, by which I mean spending that is going to happen under existing law unrelated to the PACT Act, that spending that is routine already, to be basically shifted off the books, so to speak, in such a way that is designed to make it easier for future Congresses to spend a whole lot more money on completely unrelated programs. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that this clever little device could result in up to maybe even a little more than $400 billion of additional spending over the next 10 years. Again, totally outside of the veterans space. Totally outside. Now, the chairman of the Committee on Veteran Affairs is my friend, John Tester, a guy I know and like. He pretty much essentially acknowledged that, yeah, the legislation could be exploited this way, but he said, but you should have faith. You should have confidence and trust in your colleagues, future Congresses, that we wouldn't do a thing like that. Seriously? I'm supposed to trust this and future Congresses not to go on a spending spree? Seriously? That's unbelievable. And by the way, if I should have that trust, then why did they design this feature precisely so they could go on a spending spree? This isn't the first time this has happened. A good example, the CHIPS program, right? That's an acronym for the Children's Health Insurance Program. It was created in 1997, a very popular program. It's mandatory spending. It's completely unoffset. It's a very good cause. That's why. In 2009, Congress started providing more funding than was necessary to fund the program, much more than would actually be spent on the kids that qualify for it. Congress did this very knowingly and started doing it annually. Why, you might ask? Would Congress provide more funding than the program requires? Because the amount by which this funding exceeds what gets spent can be spent on other programs. It's a trick. It's a budget trick that allows for more spending in unrelated areas. Crime Victims Fund, very similar dynamic. Criminal penalties go into a fund that's supposed to go to victims of crime, but they've set up the rules so that in any given year, if we spend less than the amount of money that went into this fund, they can pretend those are budget savings and then spend the money somewhere else. So my point, Mr. President, is that we've seen this before. It's being played out again, but I don't think we've ever seen it on this scale. $400 billion over the next 10 years. You know, we've got budgets and we have budget rules for reasons. They're meant to try to provide some guardrails on spending. Now, Congress can always disregard them. Any Congress can always disregard budget rules for a good reason or bad reasons. If there's 60 votes, the budget rules can be waived. By the way, there's 5 budget points of order against this bill. I'm not aware that anyone's raised a single one. We're not going to have a vote on anyone. And that's because people say the new spending for these veterans is so important, we're going to waive the budget rules that this bill breaks. And I think that's the right thing to do. But to think that the appropriations process is going to be a sufficient check on the abuse of this gimmick that's in this bill is very unrealistic. You know, the Senate can always vote against a future spending bill that would take advantage of this gimmick, right? So this is one of the arguments we've heard. Well, you know, you could always vote against it if Congress were to exploit this gimmick and start spending these $400 billion. Yeah, but here's the problem. In a given year, that'd be about $40 billion, right? 400 over 10 years means $400 billion of this extraneous spending annually. Except, as presiding officer knows very well, we typically fund the government with one giant bill, an omnibus spending bill that's over 1,000 pages long usually. Nowadays, it's about $1.7 trillion. And $40 billion is a lot of money. That's 3% of $1.7 trillion. And so if you object to exploiting this budget gimmick and exploiting this loophole and spending $40 billion that shouldn't be spent on who knows what, you can vote against the whole bill, and that's your only option. Vote to shut down the government and not spend any money at all. That's no disciplinary mechanism. That's no mechanism for proper oversight. Now, you may hear that my amendment caps spending for veterans. Now, I want to be very clear about this. The chairman of the VA said, my amendment would place a limit on the amount of funding Congress could provide to cover care and benefits to veterans made available by this legislation. Could create a scenario where the VA runs out of funds. That is completely, 100% factually false. It's very hard to believe that the chairman of the VA is not aware of that. But here's the truth. The fund that's created in the PACT Act, the fund that the chairman of the VA is referring to, the fund where we cap the money that goes into this fund, that fund does not have the meaning that any normal person thinks a fund has. This is not a pool of money. This is not an account at a bank from which doctors are paid. This is nothing more than an accounting device. This is just the mechanism that the federal government uses to classify spending as mandatory instead of discretionary. That's all it is. And there are no limits whatsoever. This is an important point. My amendment has no limits whatsoever on the amount that Congress can appropriate in any given year or in the cumulative total of years for veterans, health care, or other benefits. My amendment doesn't affect that in any way whatsoever. Congress could appropriate $1 trillion in a given year. What my amendment would do, it would limit the amount of that appropriation that could be considered mandatory spending as opposed to discretionary spending. That's it. My amendment is 100% about how the government designates the spending. It has nothing to do with how much is actually spent. Now, what matters to a veteran who's ill because of a toxic exposure? I think what matters to him is that the money's there to cover what he needs. That's what he should be concerned about. And that will be there. What I'm trying to limit is the extent to which they can use a budgetary gimmick to reclassify spending so that they can go on an unrelated spending binge. So what would happen if the cost for actually caring for veterans in a given year is bigger than the cap we set? The appropriators simply appropriate the amount that's needed. It has no, my cap has no bearing on how much appropriators can spend. It only limits how much gets treated as mandatory spending. If my amendment is adopted, spending on veterans' benefits would not be reduced by 1 penny. Spending on veterans' families would not be reduced by 1 penny. The $280 billion in new spending as a result of the PACT Act would not be reduced by a penny, would not be offset. We have no attempt to make any change to any of that. If anyone is suggesting that my amendment would in any way reduce care for veterans or require rationing of care, they're either completely misinformed or they're being dishonest. So why does this matter? Why did the authors of the bill want to create this device that shifts this spending that's going to happen anyway from discretionary spending to mandatory spending? It's because we have a cap on total discretionary spending, and any spending that gets pulled out of the discretionary spending category and goes into a different category, that creates a hole under the cap. Congress will fill that hole with spending on who knows what. That's the way this is going to play out. That's what's going to happen. Now, some people have suggested that my amendment, if adopted, would kill the bill. Well, think about that. An amendment that does not cut spending on veterans' care or veterans' benefits by 1 dime, but does make it harder for Congress to go on an unrelated $400 billion spending spree, that's going to kill the bill, really. Well, if that would kill the bill, then it speaks volumes about what's really important to the people who would vote no as a result. It may be clear that unrelated spending is more important than the spending on the veterans if my amendment would kill the bill. So I don't think passage of my amendment would kill the bill. It would frustrate the efforts of those who want to have the skids greased for a massive spending binge. It would definitely do that, but it wouldn't cut 1 dime of spending for veterans' care, and I think in the end the bill would pass. So I've got this very simple solution. It allows us to fully fund our vets. It eliminates this budgetary gimmick that greases the skids for this unrelated spending. And I would just urge my colleagues that hiding unrelated spending behind the sacrifice our veterans have made is no way to go. I would urge support for my amendment. And Mr. President, I move to concur in the House message to accompany S3373 with Amendment 5186.
Clerk will report.
Senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Toomey, moves
I ask
to
the
concur
reading
in
be
the House
dispensed with.
amendment, House message to accompany S3373 with amendment numbered 5186.
Without objection.
So I ask the reading be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Okay.